Is everyone seeing my screen properly? May is nodding. Okay, thumbs up. So thank you. All right.
Right.
So our topic today, I was telling Martha, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly either, but I'm going to say Chang Dai-chien is our subject today, master, scholar, and forger. And you'll see his name spelled a number of different ways when you go online because it's a Chinese name that people have written differently in English. And I want to give him a number of introductions, including just having some fun introducing him to you because he's so colorful. But here's a brief, objective introduction to who he was. He really was, and this is something he's celebrated for, he was one of the last great proponents of what you would call guohua, or traditional Chinese painting. And this is a style of painting involving ink on paper or silk that goes back, more than 1,000 years. So it's a revered ancient art form. And he really saw himself being in line with this very, very, long, deep tradition. And I guess in that way, you could call him extremely conservative. But we'll talk about later whether he was a conservative artist or a modern artist or both. I want to mention that in this tradition, the way it's taught is through copying. One copies the masters and one does it assiduously. There is no emphasis on originality like we find in modern art in the West. And there is a tradition called fuzipin, which means a precise copy or an accurate copy. And all students of this discipline would learn to do these paintings. And that's very, very important because we're going to find a very different attitude about forgery in Chinese culture. And that comes from this, emulation of the masters that's part of every student's education. And when he was confronted in the West about what we call forgery, Chang Dai-chien was absolutely contrite. He always talked about it very, very openly and very straightforwardly. He said, his work is not a forgery. He said, this is my painting. And he said, 100 years from now, you may think my painting is better than the original, which of course is very bold and, very much bragging, but it's worth considering as we talk about his career. Now I want to just entertain you a bit because this is a wonderful, rich, colorful life I'm going to tell you about. So a few interesting facts, 6 interesting facts about Chang Dai-chien. Number one, if you go to Taiwan, and you can see the National Palace Museum there, which shouldn't be missed, but you could see his green Lincoln Continental still in the garage at his Taiwan home, which has been turned into a museum. And I don't know whether green was chosen as the color of nature or the color of money, or maybe both, but there's his Continental. I understand when he lived in California, he had a fleet of luxury cars out in the driveway. He felt that the best painter in his family was his older brother, Zhang Shanzi, who died in 1941. And his brother was a very famous painter of tigers. And they together founded a painting school in Shanghai. They were very, very close. And Chang Dai-chien was devastated by his brother's death. I love this anecdote, and this was part of the preview I gave to Martha. In 1967, Chang Dai-chien was at a barbecue in a friend's backyard in Northern California. And the friend said, "Hey, there's a show of Shitao, of this 17th century painter at the University of Michigan." And Chang Dai-chien loved flying. His life was really made possible by transatlantic flights. He just said, "Let's get on the next plane." And they went to Michigan. And here's a photo of him in Michigan. They went through this show and he pointed at these alleged, masterpieces on the walls and said, "I did that. And I did that." And as a friend who was in attendance later said, you never knew when he was kidding. This is a jaw dropper. I just want to show you how strongly the career of Chang Dai-chien has taken off in China. In 2011, the net sales of his art in China and in Hong Kong was $506 million. And that same year, Picasso, who was a friend of his, made 311 million in auction sales. So he was the biggest artist sold internationally that year, and he's had a number of very big years since then. And of course, China has more billionaires than any other country in the world, and the Chinese art market is beginning to produce, extraordinary auction results like the results of Chang Dai-chien. I found out that when he was traveling, he often took a pet gibbon with him. This is a painting he did of one of his pet gibbons. He started collecting them in India and then took them to his place in Brazil when he moved there. But I love to imagine him flying with a crate of antique Chinese paintings and a gibbon in a paid airline seat. And he fathered 17 children with 4 wives. 2 of his children died as infants. One son died of a suicide just before he died. There's some tragedy connected with his life, but he was married to several women at one time in Asia. So he practiced polygamy. All right, now you've gotten a feeling for the color of his life. Let's be a little bit more objective and give you biography. He was born to an artistic family, and reportedly his mother taught him to paint flowers as a young man. And his mother had a kind of a visionary dream that she saw a man with a white beard who held a gibbon and handed it to her and urged her to take good care of it. And that's the son, you know, the dream she always associated with her son, and maybe that's connected with his habit of having gibbons as pets later. Well, I mean, what a life story. At 17, he was captured by bandits when he was away from home, and they shaved his head and demanded he work for them, and they found out he was a calligrapher. So he began writing letters for the boss of the bandits, and this man was very impressed with his calligraphy, made him an assistant. He did do robberies along with the bandits, although he told people he tried to, you know, steal as little as possible. He tried not to be, you know, the worst of the bandits. And then after about 3 months, he was rescued by his family. So you might even say he was drawn into crime as a young man. Here's an early instance of the power of his artistic abilities to fool people. His younger brother, Junshu, killed himself at age 20. And when that happened, to keep his mother from experiencing grief, he wrote letters home in his brother's calligraphy to assure his aging mother that Junshu was still alive. So there's a kind of a practical or emotional use of forgery early in his career. At the age of 21, he was studying with a couple of calligraphy masters. And I think I should mention, some of you know that when you study calligraphy, you also study poetry. So of course, Chang Dai-chien was a poet and a calligrapher, and then a painter. One of his teachers encouraged him to study the works of Shitao. And then by the age of 23, Chang Dai-chien had made a complete album of Shitao paintings. And he fooled the most prominent collector in China with his copies and made the man absolutely furious. But it was considered a kind of a triumph. And one of the Chinese values that surrounds the career of Chang Dai-chien is that if you can fool a connoisseur, you're pretty good. You know, whereas here, we want the art market to vet things for us. We want to know from the experts maybe what we're buying if we're collectors. But in China, if you can fool the collectors, you know, it's a one-upmanship. It's a different attitude. Reportedly, through the 1920s and through the 1930s, when he founded a school with his brother, he mastered the styles of about 100 ancient artists and could do their styles and could do their calligraphy competently. So he was what my father called a quick study, right? He could just pick up anything and everything. Here is some photos taken a little bit later in life with some of his students. But one of the ways he became notable, one of the ways he became famous was by teaching in Shanghai. He had so many mentees and so many artists whose careers that he guided. And a lot of them also made copies, including copies of his work. And sometimes in museum collections, you find a Chang Dai-chien that's actually a forgery by one of his students. But of course, they revered him and looked up to him. Many of them followed him when he left Asia. He visited Japan in 1931, which was kind of a dangerous thing to do because of the developing conflict between Japan and China. But he learned a lot of silk dyeing techniques there that later guided the work he did that's called splash ink artwork. But then when the Japanese were actually in China later that year and in the following years, he used lying and deception to avoid capture, because as kind of a VIP and celebrity, they wanted his paintings and they wanted him, but he feigned illness and did some different things to not be captured by the Japanese and to slip away. As World War II formed, and as there were more conflicts between Japan and China, he slipped away into caves in northwest China. And he actually spent 3 years there with an entourage, all kinds of painters and monks and scholars, disciples. He stayed there a total of about 3 years. And one of the things I've heard said about Chang Dai-chien is that by the time he left China in 1949, his eyes had seen more ancient Chinese art than any other scholar in the world. And I think that's probably a good statement. I mean, absolutely, there were some other experts that came to the West and knew the history of Chinese art, but he had seen so much. And his scholarly copies of these frescoes were really unprecedented and really helped later preserve those frescoes. So developing the scholar side of his life, Dunhuang was very, very important. Just saying something about the women in his life, I wanted to give you a few visuals. You can see on the left a woman who was the mother of 8 of his children, who had to stay in China when he left, or maybe chose to stay in China. Eventually, she asked him for a divorce, but I don't think she got it. She was the mother of 8 of his children. He had lovers. He had a Chinese lover in Korea. He had a Japanese lover that he rhapsodized about quite a bit in his art and his poetry. And then finally, his 4th wife, who you're going to see in photos that I show you when he's living in Carmel. Here we go. She was a classmate of his daughter, who was 14 when they met. And she did leave China with him and then live with him until the end of his life. So talking a little bit about the revolution, I just want to talk about it in terms of art. After the revolution, going into the 1950s, there wasn't what you or I would call modern art in China. There was art that served the party. So the artists that did continue to make art would have been modern artists of this type. They would have been painting Mao. You could have made a good career painting Mao. You could have painted Soviet-style propaganda. You could have painted social realism. But artists like Chang Dai-chien, the traditionalists, mainly had left for Taiwan, or the ones who remained in China were persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. A number of Chang Dai-chien's family members who remained in China faced political persecution, and many of his works were destroyed in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution. So I want to emphasize that, kind of what he took with him was a tradition that was being wiped out for political purposes. After 1949, he traveled to a number of places. He was in Taiwan, he was in Hong Kong, he was in India, where he made these elegant images of women modeled after Indian movie posters. Very versatile artist. And then using modern air transportation, when you read about him, he was just about everywhere in the 1950s and 1960s. He really traveled extensively. And I found, when I was writing an article about him, I found this news photo from Associated Press from 1952. There he is in San Francisco, looking fairly young. And they call him an Oriental genius. And he was there, he was visiting a man named Chang Shu-ki. And Chang Shu-ki's son is now a history professor at Stanford University, who I was able to visit. But he was the first Chinese artist to widely demonstrate ink painting. In fact, there was a spread about him in Life magazine in the 1940s. So he probably set up that tradition that Chang Dai-chien would follow, the big public demonstrations that mesmerized people. Because you want to remember that Chinese culture like this had been so how do we say, curtained off from the West. So here he is demonstrating at Otis, I think in the late 1940s. But in the Bay Area, he was living there and he was making cards. He made greeting cards to support himself. And Chang Dai-chien and his brother, the tiger painter, had been friends with Chang Shu-ki. And so he visited annually until Chang Shu-ki's death, I think in the mid 1950s. He really began to settle, or he tried to settle down in Brazil in the 1950s. And he had, by this time, a very, very lavish lifestyle. He had a large piece of acreage called the Garden of Virtues, and every bit of cash he could come up with because he was selling paintings he had taken out of China. He bought bonsai, he bought imported flowers, he had Tibetan mastiffs and gibbons, and even bears at one point walking around the property. He had artificial lakes. And the costume he's wearing, by the way, he was a very theatrical man, was actually made by a Chinese woman who had worked in Hollywood, making costumes professionally. So he had himself made the robes of a literati artist, an ancient artist, and would pose for photographers like he did in this case. So he really was creating a kind of theater of ancient China and promoting his own reputation in Brazil. And Brazil was filled with Chinese immigrants and also a lot of Chinese crime, which is a very interesting story. He traveled in Europe extensively, and I want to mention something that happened to him in 1957, which is just after the slide that I'm showing you here. He was helping move a large decorative rock on his property in Brazil, and he ruptured the capillaries in one of his eyes. He injured an eye very, very badly. And after that, his eyesight was troubled. He had a couple of operations, including one in New York that didn't go well, and then one later in California that did go well. But he was seeing out of one eye. It restricted his output. And scholars really think that it was this incident, but it was in the mid-1950s, that the question of was he selling originals and was he selling forgeries really began to crop up. But in 1956, he was the subject of 2 shows in Paris, and sensational shows. In one of them, you can see the catalog cover here. He showed the mural copies he'd made in northern China, and he also showed what he called his Great Wind collection, the originals that he had taken out of China. And of course, now looking back, you have to wonder how many of those originals were things that he had made. We're still sorting that out. But while in Paris, he sold this painting that you see above there, a scroll that is more than 1,200 years old, allegedly, sold it to the city of Paris. And the director of the Chernuchy Museum and all kinds of experts signed letters saying this is absolutely an antique original. And the city of Paris paid $80,000, which I think that it's the equivalent of $1 million now. It was the world record for a piece of Chinese artwork of any kind. And of course, a few years ago, the Chernuchy finally admitted that they don't think it's an original. Very likely it was made by Chang Dai-chien. So the history of forgeries begins to crop up. He's often called the Chinese Picasso, which is pretty apt in a lot of ways. They were both fountains of creativity. They both had, very, very full personal lives. They knew each other. It was arranged that they meet in 1956. And Chang Dai-chien taught Picasso a little bit of Chinese painting because Picasso was trying to paint with Chinese brushes. Chinese always had the idea that Western brushes were very disappointing. They were flat. They only were made from a few kinds of bristles. And so Chang Dai-chien actually critiqued Picasso, which was a ballsy thing to do. And then years later, he sent him a set of expensive brushes that were made from the ears of 2,500 calves, 3-year-old calves. So, he was in touch with Picasso, and Picasso painted this portrait of him, which one friend of mine says looks like an angry caterpillar. Reportedly, too, Chang Dai-chien's wife didn't think that Picasso was a very good painter. She didn't like what she saw on that visit. So it must have been interesting. Would have been fun to be a fly on the wall when they got together. In 1957, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston purchased a painting from Chang Dai-chien. And you can see it here. You can see the full scroll, and you can see a detail of it. It's called The Foot of a Precipitous Mountain. It's allegedly, an ancient painting over 1,000 years old. But as was later discovered, it was a forgery by Chang Dai-chien. And when we talk about the topic of forgery, of course, he was making, fuzipin. He was making, trying to emulate the copy, the images of masters. But he also really made an effort to set these things in an ancient context. He found containers and boxes that were closed with wax seals. The man you see here in the photo, Pu Ru, was a member of a Manchu aristocratic family, and he helped do the old-fashioned style of calligraphy on some of the inscriptions and colophons and some of the boxes. You know, they really did collaborate, even in aging the papers and the scrolls, to do everything to present them as ancient originals. He continued to be, you know, very, very much talked about and popular in Europe, having shows in Paris. In 1961, he had a show of giant lotus paintings in Paris. And in the United States, he had a show at Herschel and Adler in New York, where he sold a group of giant lotus paintings for $120,000 to the Annenberg family, the Reader's Digest family, which I think still owns those paintings. So again, it would be the equivalent of a kind of $1 million sale. And that was, you know, widely reported in the press. Lotuses became one of his favorite subjects, you know, large and small. And later in life, you know, when he needed a little bit of cash, he would paint some quick lotuses and sell them off and, you know, make money very, very easily. But they are, you know, also a much copied form of his art. There were a lot of shenanigans going on, and of course, we'll never know some of the shenanigans, but here's one of the things I discovered doing research on Chang Dai-chien. He was very, very close friends with a UNESCO official named Dr. Kuo Yu Shu, and he's a man, he still has relatives in the Bay Area, not far from me. He was an extremely well-educated man who'd gone to school in Paris as a young man, and then he was a UNESCO official in the 50s and the 1960s. He was an education specialist. And he's probably the guy that transported a lot of artwork to the United States. He used to have diplomatic immunity. He had diplomatic pouches. And there's a story about how he took some works of art from Paris to the United States and then came back and walked into his bank in France. And when the bank manager saw him, he had the whole staff stand up and click their heels because he had deposited so much money in the bank. So he was Chang Dai-chien's dealer. Chang Dai-chien would stay with him when he was in Paris. Dr. Kuo Yu Shu also got Chang's work into the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was quite a coup. I mean, quite a thing to do. But in the mid-1960s, there was a big, you know, turnaround. Dr. Kuo he became the highest ranking spy for Beijing to defect from Taiwan. And after a suicide attempt and some time in a French jail, he returned to Beijing, you know, never to be seen again. And when that happened, Chang Dai-chien lost one of his best friends and also lost his dealer. And that may be one of the reasons that he came to the United States. In the United States, there was more and more interest about Asian art. And, you know, to give you a few features from that, you can see Avery Brundage here looking at a Tibetan statue. If you read the news, you may have heard that Avery Brundage is somebody who's been kind of canceled lately. They took his statue down at the Museum of Asian Art in San Francisco, which is too bad because he really did found their collection. But he was bringing Asian antiquities to the United States and promising them to the De Young Museum if they built a new wing. And then artists like Huang Junbi, who was a waterfall painter, began to visit from Taiwan on special visas. And you see Huang Junbi here in San Francisco in front of a Chinese art gallery. There were 2 or 3 galleries now in San Francisco showing authentic ink painting. The Macy's window reportedly had one big display once of Chinese painting. And of course, people were fascinated in so many ways. They were fascinated by the scroll painting. They were fascinated by the seals and the poetry and the collector stamps that were on the Asian works of art. So at the same time, in 1961 and 1962, a select group of items that are now part of the core of the National Palace Museum in Taiwan toured, and they came to the United States. And they came protected on a battleship. I mean, these were, you know, world-class treasures. About 700,000 people saw them in San Francisco and in Boston. And this show completely transformed and opened up the field of Asian art history in the United States. It was after this show, but, you know, Stanford got Michael Sullivan and UC Berkeley got James Cahill, and all kinds of professorships, all sorts of studies, all sorts of departments really opened up, and people were thrilled to see these Chinese works. So that set the stage for dealers and gallery owners. And the couple that you see here, the Lockeys, were a couple in Carmel that took an interest in Asian art. From what I understand from their daughter, it was Mrs. Laki who really began expressing an interest in Chinese art. And using special visas in 1965, there were 3 Chinese artists that visited the Bay Area and began teaching, Yet Por Cheng, James Liu, and Chang Chi Weng. And you see them here at their show in 1965 in Carmel. I think they all knew Chang Dai-chien, and at least one, I think, had been a student of his. So they probably helped make the connection that allowed him to arrive in 1967. And thinking about 1967, you know, if you're old enough to know the history, and you probably are, you know that the Vietnam War was beginning to emerge. There was a strong anti-communist sentiment in the United States. And so for Chang Dai-chien to come to Stanford University, he was both exotic, but he was politically of interest. And he stepped off a plane and gave a live demonstration at Tresidder Union upstairs at Stanford. And then they had a show of his work at Stanford Museum. And the story goes that so many people showed up at the opening at Stanford Museum that a number of the docents just fled. They just left because they had never seen so many people in the museum. So he brought this aura of celebrity and exotic interest wherever he went. And you can see Michael Sullivan, whose wife Cohn spoke Sichuanese. She served as the translator with Chang Dai-chien, and they later exchanged a lot of letters and a lot of works of art. So he had a show at the Laki Gallery that opened in 1967. And you can see it's kind of a reunion here with some of the artists who had helped bring him. He stayed in the Carmel Monterey area for about 4 months and gave more painting demonstrations. And one of the things that happened while he was there, he absolutely painted California themed artworks, including this beautiful scroll, Summer on California Mountain, which was a kind of a reference to the Chinese gold miners that had come to the United States in the 19th century. And then remarkably, there also was a color film made of him while he was here. And this film went undiscovered for a long time, but then about 10 years ago, San Francisco State had a Chang Dai-chien show, and they asked around and found this color movie of Chang Dai-chien in the photographer's garage where it hadn't been shown for decades. So I'm going to switch over to YouTube real quickly, and I'm going to show you a 2-minute movie trailer. It's a movie that's being made by a filmmaker at San Francisco State, but includes color footage of Chang Dai-chien walking at Point Lobos and working in his studio. And it's going to give you a really, really good vision to kind of see him in California and to get a feeling of what he was like. So let me switch to YouTube.
Arguably one of the most important Chinese painters in the 20th century, Chang Dai-chien is acclaimed for his unparalleled productivity, stylistic diversity, and charismatic personality. His paintings integrate Chinese and Western art tradition, developing the splash color technique that is a modernization of Chinese painting. Chang Dai-chien first trained as a calligraphist in pre-communist China before relocating to the jungles of Brazil and finally the coast of California. Along the way, he gained renown as an alleged forger and eventually an expressionist and impressionist painter. His passion for work led him to every corner of artistic expression. Although he spent half his life and artistic career in the West, he remains unknown by most of the American art world. Through never-before-seen footage and intimate family interviews, audiences will be taken inside the genius of Chang Dai-chien.
That film has been screened, by the way, but I think the filmmaker's still at work on it. It's a film that's a work in process, but such beautiful footage. I wanted you to see that and, take that in for the visuals. So talking about his splashed ink style, Chang Dai-chien, when he visited New York, which he did a number of times in the 60s, he got very competitive. He saw the work of abstract expressionist painters, and he reportedly said to one of his friends, "They're beating us." And that's what he said about American painters of the era. And so using some of the techniques he had learned in Japan, he began experimenting with mineral pigments. And these mineral pigments, that including oxides and malachite, he would drip and spatter them. He would hold up works of art edgewise. They brought out hair dryers to dry them at different rates. And he began including this, kind of dripped, spattered, accidental form of color, along with a very traditional line work. And for that reason, it's for these paintings that he is considered one of the first modern Chinese artists. And this is a painting that he showed at the Locke Gallery in 1972, and it was actually owned by the Locke family's daughter until recently when she auctioned it. It's called Snowstorm in Switzerland, and you can see it's almost completely abstract. It really would be closer to Helen Frankenthaler, than it would be to Chitao. So these are the paintings that have caused a lot of interest in the Chinese auction market and a lot of debate over Chang Dai-chien's artistic identity. When I was doing research for the article I wrote 3 years ago, I was able to find some photos that hadn't been published. These are some photos that were taken for the Carmel Pine Cone in 1970. Here he is with Fang Zhaolin, a former student who's also a well-known painter in Hong Kong, visiting his home in Carmel, and also a scene of his dining room. He was absolutely a Chinese gourmet, always serving the best and most expensive and most exotic dishes to his friends. And I have located a couple people who ate there at his home who described the meals and, still remember and still talk about that. Of course, he attracted visitors all the time, visitors from China, visitors from Taiwan, local academics like Professor Maurice Chen. And there he is sitting in his driveway on Magella Road in Carmel, waiting for visitors to pull up. He liked to drive, he liked to get in the car, and his favorite place to go was Yosemite. And he had a photograph his brother had taken of Yosemite in the 1930s when he came here to raise money for the nationalist forces for Chiang Kai-shek. So I think he associated Yosemite with his brother. He was, of course, a social butterfly and a real celebrity. When you go back through newspaper archives, he shows up all the time in the San Francisco newspapers. Here he is at an opening at the new Avery Brundage Wing, the new Asian Art Museum in San Francisco in about 1970. Here he is being picked up at the airport by Sam Wong, who was a San Francisco hotel owner and a big friend and supporter of his. And in 1972, he was given the only full retrospective of his lifetime. And this is a really interesting moment because the curator who organized it was René d'Argence. He had been in Paris at the time of the original Chang Dai-chien shows. He'd helped organize those. And the retrospective went two different ways. On the one hand, one reviewer in the Bay Area called it, and this is a quote, "the greatest show of Chinese art in the 20th century." So talk about a superlative. He was given these superlative reviews. But on the other hand, no museum director anywhere in the United States would accept this as a traveling show. They really, really tried to make the show travel. Nobody would take it. And of course, it was because all through the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, more and more museum directors and curators were becoming embarrassed by realizing that they had taken donations of or purchased forgeries that were connected to Chang Dai-chien. So on the one hand, he was kind of on top of the world. And on the other hand, he was being talked about as a forger quietly. Professor James Cahill at Berkeley, who knew Chang Dai-chien very, very well, spent a lot of time with him, began cataloging what he thought were forgeries. And eventually he identified 63 forgeries in American museum collections. And you can go to jamescahill.com and read a lot of his blogs and read his essays, read his arguments. but he got involved in symposiums after the artist died, arguing about what was a forgery and what wasn't. But the most famous example is his painting, The Riverbank, that's part of the collection of the Met. And they still, on their website, display it as the work of a 10th century master. There still are a large number of experts who say, oh no, that's by Chang Dai-chien. So that's some of the confusion that he left behind. Here he is working on a lithograph at Editions Press in the early 1970s. If you see that one eyeglass is darker than the other over on the right, that's the eye that was injured, that he still used very, very little. In the late 1970s, he traveled more and more, and eventually he was spending enough time in Taiwan that some friends there said, we want to build you a house. We'll fund you a house and a studio in Taiwan. You need to move here. And you have to wonder if maybe there was also political pressure or rumors or issues created by the forgeries. But I think 1976 or 1977 was the last time he was in California. And in Taiwan, where he actually found himself rather lonely, all in all, there were a couple things that happened that are worth talking about. One is he ran into a man who had let him take his collection on the airplane leaving China in 1949, and he gave that man a painting, recognized him years and years later. But he also completed a number of big paintings, including a massive scroll that's called his Memory of Mount Lu. People say it's an unfinished painting, but it combines his traditionalist technique and splashed ink in one last kind of ambitious masterpiece. And then after he died, his home was made a museum. And if you go there now, you actually will see a wax Chang Dai-chien at work in his studio, which is a little peculiar, in addition to the Lincoln Continental. And of course, he's buried under a massive stone that he had brought from California out in the garden. So let's talk about the market. Let's talk about how the art market now sees Chang Dai-chien. Here's a group of 8 scrolls that was sold by Clara's auction in California in 2017. That brought $3 million, which is a pretty impressive price for a group of scrolls. But maybe more remarkably, in 2016 in Hong Kong, this single scroll called the Peach Blossom Scroll sold for nearly $35 million. So that gives you an idea of the reputation that he has in mainland China. His large works, his large scrolls, his large panels sell for just spectacular prices, which is what makes up his art market. These 2 collectors alone have bought about $500 million worth of Chang Dai-chien paintings for their private collections. And there's a new museum going up. I understand it's nearly complete, but in his home city, there is this kind of fabulous multi-pavilion museum that alleges it'll bring together Eastern and Western styles in displaying his artwork. And I think there's another Chang Dai-chien museum as well, but this is the one that came up when I Googled it. And then in the Bay Area, when I was doing research, I was able to meet some of his family members. He still has a number of family in the Bay Area. This is Zhang Daqian. She's 92, or she was 92 when I met her a year ago. And it was her classmate that became his final wife. So, I mean, that's quite a story. And she's a calligrapher who is posing here with one of her calligraphies. And if you're in San Francisco, the Sam Wong Hotel in Chinatown, they now call it the SW. They took away Sam's name, but they call it the SW. If you go in the lobby, they have an original Chang Dai-chien hanging there in the lobby, as well as some other fine Chinese works. And every member of Sam's family has Chang Dai-chien paintings that they treasure. He was very well known in Chinatown and had a lot of friends there. So I think a question to ask, and this is where we can start unmuting ourselves and taking this all in and talking about it, is, how do you see him? I mean, do you want to see him as a very manipulative man who was cynical, manipulative forger? It's been estimated that he sold about $10 million in the 50s and 60s in forged paintings, which now would be, 70, 80, 90 million dollars. On the other hand, there were some genuine cultural misunderstandings. He never denied making copies of old masters. He always acknowledged it the moment anybody brought it up. So you have to think about how you view him. And then as one final slide, I wanted to mention this. The topic of forgery and China are still closely linked, maybe because of these confusing cultural values. If you watch this show on Netflix, you'll find out how the Nedler Gallery in New York sold $80 million worth of Rothkos and Diebenkorns and Jackson Pollocks that were all made by this man, who is a Chinese artist, copied their works, very, very well and very, very inexpensively. And maybe you could say that in some way, some of that is the legacy of Chang Dai-chien.